A frontier cook in the Canadian North once turned a pot of water, a handful of fat, and 3 ingredients most people would have thrown away into a meal that kept 8 men working for 2 days straight. These are 10 cooking tricks that came out of the Canadian frontier, and every single one of them still works today. They were not discovered in test kitchens. They were figured out by people who had no room for error, no second chances, and no one to ask for help. Some of these will change the way you cook. Number 6 sounds completely wrong the first time you hear it. And number 1 is something almost nobody does anymore, which is exactly why everything they made tasted better than what we make today. Number 10, rub your cast iron with an onion after cooking, not before. Most people season their cast iron with oil. Frontier cooks did something stranger, and it worked better. After cooking, while the pan was still warm, they cut a raw onion in half and rubbed the cut face across the entire surface of the iron. The sulfur compounds in the onion lifted residue that oil alone could not reach, while the natural sugars left behind bonded to the iron as it cooled and added to the seasoning layer rather than stripping it. Saloon cooks across the Canadian West used this method on pans that had been in continuous daily use for years. Those pans developed a surface so smooth and non-stick that men commented on it in diaries. The trick cost nothing, took 30 seconds, and produced results that modern cast iron enthusiasts are only now rediscovering. Number 9, add a pinch of baking soda to your bean pot, not salt. Beans were everywhere on the Canadian frontier. They were cheap, they traveled well, and a 100-pound sack could feed a crew for weeks. The problem was cooking time. On a trail drive or a winter patrol, waiting 6 hours for beans to soften was time nobody had. The trick was a pinch of baking soda added to the soaking water the night before. The alkaline environment broke down the outer skin of the bean at a molecular level, cutting cooking time nearly in half and producing a texture that was creamy all the way through rather than soft on the outside and chalky in the center. Frontier cooks who knew this trick were worth their weight in pemmican. The ones who didn't were still waiting on their beans when everyone else had already eaten and gone to sleep. Number 8, toast your flour before you make gravy. This is the trick that separated a good frontier cook from a great one, and it costs nothing extra to do. Before adding flour to pan drippings to make gravy, experienced saloon cooks scattered the flour dry into a hot pan and stirred it constantly for 2 to 3 minutes until it turned the color of light sand and smelled faintly of nuts. Then, and only then, did it go into the drippings. Toasted flour thickens at a lower ratio than raw flour, which means less flour and more flavor. It also eliminates the raw, pasty taste that untoasted flour leaves behind, the taste that makes gravy feel heavy instead of rich. Cowboys who ate at saloons run by cooks who knew this trick requested the same gravy for years without ever understanding why it tasted different from every other gravy they had ever eaten. Number 7, freeze your bannock dough before you cook it. This one sounds wrong. It isn't. Frontier cooks in the Canadian North discovered, largely by accident during the first brutal winters, that bannock dough left outside overnight in freezing temperatures and then cooked the next morning produced a noticeably lighter, more open texture than dough cooked fresh. The reason is simple. The water in the dough freezes into small ice crystals that expand the structure slightly before cooking. When the dough hits the heat, those crystals melt and create tiny pockets of air that raw dough does not have. The result is bannock that is still dense by modern bread standards, but dramatically better than the flat, heavy version that gave it its reputation. Klondike miners who spent winters in the Yukon made their bannock dough the night before as a matter of habit. They thought they were saving time in the morning. They were accidentally making better bread. Number 6. Use tea to tenderize tough meat, not just wine. Wine was not available on most Canadian frontier outposts. Tea was everywhere. And it turns out that tea does something to tough cuts of meat that no frontier cook fully understood, but every experienced one had figured out by trial and error. The tannins in black tea down muscle fiber in the same way that the acids in wine do, slowly, gently, and without adding any flavor that doesn't belong in a savory dish. Northwest Mounted Police cooks on long winter patrols soaked tough cuts of moose and bison overnight in strong, cooled tea before braising them the next day. The meat came out tender enough to cut with a spoon. The tea flavor disappeared completely in cooking. The tannins did their job and left without leaving a trace. It is one of the most useful tricks in this entire list, and almost nobody outside of the Canadian North ever learned it. Here is what connects every trick on this list. None of them were invented by someone trying to be clever. They were discovered by people cooking under pressure, in cold that cracked wood, with ingredients that arrived once a month if the supply wagon made it through, for men who had no patience for food that didn't work. The Canadian frontier was not a place that rewarded waste or rewarded failure. Every trick that survived did so because it produced results every time. Number 5. Salt your cast iron with coarse salt to clean it, not soap. Soap destroys the seasoning on cast iron. Every experienced frontier cook knew this, which is why none of them used it. Instead, they poured a generous layer of coarse salt into a warm pan and scrubbed it with a folded cloth or a piece of burlap. The salt acted as an abrasive, lifting burnt residue and grease without stripping the iron seasoning layer underneath. Then the salt was discarded, the pan was wiped dry, and a thin film of fat was rubbed across the surface before storing. Pans maintained this way in Canadian frontier kitchens lasted for generations. Some of them are still in use today. The method requires no special equipment, costs almost nothing, and works better than every modern cast iron cleaning product currently on the market. Number 4. Let your sourdough starter smell like nail polish remover. It isn't ruined. This is the piece of knowledge that would have saved dozens of Klondike miners from throwing away a perfectly good sourdough starter and facing a winter without fresh bread. A starter that smells sharply acetone nail polish remover is not dead. It is hungry. The acetone smell is produced by the wild yeast consuming the last of its available sugars and beginning to produce alcohol as a byproduct. It is a sign of a starter that is extremely active and extremely underfed, not one that has gone bad. Feed it once with equal parts flour and water. Leave it somewhere warm for 4 hours, and the smell disappears completely. The starter bounces back stronger than before. Klondike bakers who knew this kept their cultures alive through winters that killed everything else. The ones who didn't know it started over from scratch and waited 3 weeks for their culture to develop again. Number 3. Cook your oats in bone broth, not water. This trick sounds odd until you try it, and then it becomes impossible to go back. Frontier cooks across the Canadian North who had bone broth on hand, which was most of them, most of the time, used it as the cooking liquid for morning oats instead of plain water. The result was a bowl of porridge with a depth of savory flavor underneath the natural sweetness of the oats that water simply cannot produce. No additional salt was needed. The fat in the broth gave the oats a richness that kept men satisfied through hours of hard physical work in cold that burned calories faster than a modern person can easily imagine. Mounties on winter patrol ate oats cooked this way every morning. They didn't think of it as a trick. They thought of it as breakfast. Number 2. Rest your meat on a wooden surface, not a metal one. When a cut of meat came off the fire on the Canadian frontier, experienced cooks always rested it on wood, a cutting board, a plank, the flat lid of the chuck box, never on a metal plate or a tin surface. Metal conducts heat away from the meat immediately and aggressively, continuing the cooking process and tightening the muscle fibers just as they need to relax. Wood insulates. It holds the heat in the meat rather than pulling it away, allowing the internal temperature to equalize and the juices to redistribute through the cut. The result is meat that is tender and juicy all the way through rather than overcooked at the edges and underdone in the center. Frontier cooks did not know the science behind it. They knew that meat rested on wood tasted better than meat rested on tin, and that was enough. Number 1. Always cook with the lid on. This is the trick that runs underneath everything else on this list. And it is the one that modern cooking has almost completely abandoned. Every great frontier dish, the bannock in the Dutch oven, the bean pot buried in coals, the bone broth simmering for hours, the braised moose kept going through a long winter night, was cooked covered. The lid kept the moisture in, the heat even, and the cooking time predictable. It also allowed a cook to leave the fire and do other things, which on a working frontier was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Modern cooking celebrates the open pan, the reduction, the sear. All of those techniques have their place. But the covered pot, given enough time and the right ingredients, produces food with a depth and tenderness that nothing cooked uncovered can match. The frontier cooks who kept entire expeditions alive understood that patience was an ingredient. They just didn't have a word for it. These 10 tricks were not written down in any cookbook. They were passed between cooks who learned them the hard way, in kitchens that had no margin for error. They still work, every single one of them.